Hi everybody, it's Dr. Crone. Sorry I couldn't be with you today. I hope that if you have any questions about grading or anything like that that your substitute can't answer, please just email me and I'm happy to do that, and I will be with you next Tuesday, just like normal. So today we're going to start off with retrieval practice, and we're not bothering with blue books today, so just use your notebooks, or if you need to, use your iPad for this. Now this is going to take some memory on your part because this is the lecture we had the day before the snow days started. So I'm going to make sure everybody's ready, and then when you're ready, here are your questions. Okay, hope that went all right. And now just one of the reasons I reviewed that is because some of those topics you're going to need to address in the activity that you're going to be doing in your state groups. So before we can do that, let's talk a little bit more about state constitutions, and especially talking about the movements there have been over time, really for over 100 years, to try to reform state constitutions. And basically, they've all been directed towards the area of trying to correct those problems of that positive law tradition, the problems that we talked about on the last time we had a lecture on state constitutions. Things like they're too long, they have lots of particularistic laws, they're really easy to amend, and so you get all kinds of just a really lengthy, sometimes, you know, incorrectly, I should say, or unintentionally funny situations, like the Constitution that includes things about pregnant pigs. So all along, basically, people have been trying to answer the question of whether these type of constitutions are negative for state government. Do they make it difficult for state governments to function? And, you know, a lot of what we talked about last time all went in the direction of yes. And I think a lot of political scientists and sort of good government types of people, reformers, have really looked on these long, particularistic, positive law constitutions as being a negative for state government. And there are some negatives for sure. There are, you know, it increases the likelihood of there being lawsuits. The state gets sued more often because the Constitution is so specific and it's so easy for the government to accidentally implement it incorrectly. There are so many contradictory things that also then require the courts to just have more and more lawsuits and hear more and more lawsuits to try to straighten out the example where, you know, at one point Ohio had two contradictory constitutional amendments on the ballot, and if they had both passed, which actually neither of them passed, but if they had both passed, we would have ended up with two amendments to the Constitution that directly contradicted each other, and that would have required the courts to sort out which one of them applied under which conditions. And, you know, a lot of people assume that has a negative impact on state government. Now, I do want to let you know that there's a whole other side to it as well, of people who said, and some of you said this in your answers to my description about, you know, should we have a new constitutional convention in Ohio like we vote for every 20 years? Would you have voted to call for a new constitutional convention? And some of you said no, and a lot of the reasons people gave for saying no were that you know, it's working so far. Why, if it ain't broke, why fix it? And you know, some people would say, hey, most of the 50 states have positive law type constitutions, and so far it doesn't look like they're, you know, not functioning. They seem to be functioning okay as a state. So it's really a question, and I'm not going to try to tell you the answer to that. I'm just going to let you think about it as you go through the lecture today, and then also looking up stuff about your state's constitution. So really, the movement to reform state constitutions was part of a much broader reform effort that was started by a group of people known as the Progressives, and the Progressives were actually a political party for a hot second. Now, I'm hoping that some of you remember the Progressives from your American history class. And yes, I know you all took one. So the Progressives were active from the late 1800s through the 1930s or so. In They had a lot of reforms that they pushed for. It wasn't just political reforms. It certainly wasn't just state and local government reforms. These were folks who wanted better working conditions. They supported labor unions. They supported women's rights, including the women's right to vote. Strangely enough, they also were opposed to alcohol and alcohol consumption, and the Progressives, one of their big successes was getting pushed through the prohibition laws, which was an amendment to the U.S. Constitution, and then it was repealed after a while because people decided alcohol needed to be legal. So the Progressives did a lot of things. They pushed for a lot of changes. In fact, many of the types of things they were for, such as more income equality, more democratic participation by people, more rights for workers, curtailing the power of big businesses. A lot of those things we still see today reflected in the Democratic Party positions and in sort of what we consider liberal ideology today. But back then, the Progressives really aimed their reforms in many times on state and local politics. They were very much more powerful at the state and local level than they ever were at the national level. And in fact, the state of Wisconsin actually had a Progressive Party governor and many Progressive Party state legislators as well. So what were they trying to do with state and local politics? There were two things that the Progressives really disliked, and that was the power of big business, and especially their power in political movements, their influence on lawmaking. And also, kind of a related thing was they were very opposed to what they saw as corruption, and there was a lot of corruption during this time, particularly at the local government level, but also the state government level. So if you remember from American history class, this was the time of the big city political machines like Boss Tweed in New York. A lot of people remember that name if they don't remember anything else. The local parties being called machines, where they would literally sell you a job working for the government in local government if you would promise, to pay or to more likely to support them and try and get them votes. A lot of these people who were in government at the time were on the take. They were just using the government money to line their own pockets and get rich, give their friends jobs, that kind of thing. And that kind of corruption was very much a target of the Progressives, both in local and state governments. The Progressives were also obsessed with efficiency. This was a time of the early 1900s was a time when science and industry all wanted to do things very efficiently, like a machine. If you think about this was the time when the factories developed the assembly line to make cars really efficiently. And a lot of progressives thought government could be done efficiently, almost like a machine. So that was something else they really wanted, to make it more efficient. And of course, a really long, contradictory, messy constitution wasn't very efficient in their mind. And finally, they wanted to make government more democratic by involving the people more often. They were really in favor of anything that gave more people the vote on more types of either elected offices or also on laws themselves. They really liked the idea of direct democracy. So the progressives set up what they thought an ideal constitution for a state should be. Now they're just a group. They can't force the states to change their minds. They can't force anybody to change their mind, but they set out what they thought a state constitution should ideally look like. It should be shorter than most state constitutions were at the time. It should be like the US Constitution and just focus on fundamental law. One of the things they really hated about particularistic laws was that they saw, rightly so, that these were opportunities for wealthy individuals and business interests and economic interest groups to get their way, going around the legislature by getting something into the Constitution that then probably could not be overturned. So the progressives really said, no, the Constitution is not the place for that. Those interest groups shouldn't be meddling around in our constitutions. If they want to lobby, they should have to lobby interest groups, although the progressives really wouldn't have liked lobbying. And then finally, they wanted the Constitution to have built into it an opportunities for direct democracy. We're going to talk a lot more about state level direct democracy when we talk about elections. But these are things where citizens would actually vote on state laws. And we have those today. Many states have direct democracy today. In fact, most of them do. So the progressives did something that was very typical for them. So they came up with this template constitution. It was called a model state constitution. It's literally like a template for a resume that you would get off of the internet. Honestly, that's almost exactly what it's like. Except for instead of being a resume, it's a constitution. It had blanks in it for you to put the name of your state and how long the terms of office for the governor and the state legislature would be and things like that. And they called this the Model State Constitution, and it was put together in 1912, and they really wanted to encourage as many states as possible to do this. They saw this as the right kind of constitution, as a very efficient constitution. And it really had 5 purposes. That was all it was going to do. It was going to do fundamental law to set up the state government itself, and then also set up ways for the state government to officially recognize local governments. We'll talk about that a lot next week when we talked about municipal governments, but things like how many levels of municipal government should there be, and how would states go about giving them power. So fundamental law is 1 and 2. 3 and 4 is about granting and denying power, just like the US Constitution does, to those institutions and then to the local governments. And then finally, they thought every constitution should have a Bill of Rights. And I do believe all the state constitutions have a Bill of Rights. These were the elements they included, almost exactly like an outline. You may see with your state's constitution the framework of this outline, especially if your state did either create a constitution after 1912 or revise their constitution along the way. They may very well have taken on this order of items from the model constitution. Just a couple things here that were I want to point out as specific sort of pet projects of the progressives, things that they really believed in and wanted states to do. Public education. Before this time, some states didn't actually provide for public education or guarantee it to students, to young people. Many states only had guaranteed public education through sometimes the 6th grade, sometimes 8th grade. The progressives really believed in the power of education to lift people up out of difficult circumstances. They actually thought that educated workers would be more likely to advocate for their own rights and to be treated better by management if they were well educated. And certainly I think that is probably true and has been borne out. So that was something they really liked. And then they also liked the idea of civil service. We talked about that last semester in your American Gov class. Civil service means that the bureaucrats, the people that are hired to work in government jobs, people like teachers and firefighters and other kinds of administrators that work in government offices, that they would be given their jobs based on merit, based on being good at their job, rather than as a political favor. And that civil service was really going to take the teeth out of the power, the corrupt power of political machines, because they would no longer be able to just give out jobs for cities or states as just a favor, as a thank you to their cronies who did them well or paid them money in order to get those jobs. So public education and civil service were two really important progressive ideas. So this was the elements of the model constitution, and they talked a lot of states. A lot of states were influenced by this thinking. A lot of states were kind of eager to try this out. Now you're going to see this more often in Midwestern states than in the East Coast states, for sure. It was progressivism had the height of its power geographically was the Midwest. You're also going to see it in some of the younger states, especially the ones that were added to the Constitution or added to the Union later on. The Mountain West, I just had a group of students studying Utah, and they found that Utah had something that really resembled the model state constitution. So yeah, you may see that, but you're more likely to see that in a Midwestern state. Ohio called a constitutional convention in 1912. You'll notice that's the same year that the model constitution came out. That was a popular time for states to consider revising their constitutions. And many states did make a few changes, but there weren't very many that made drastic changes at that time. With the exception of Nebraska, which was a big difference. They really liked the progressive ideals. Wisconsin and some of those states also really adopted something modeled along the model constitution. But a lot of states like Ohio did not come out of their reform-minded convention having made huge changes to their constitution. Interestingly enough, Alaska and Hawaii both both actually created their first constitution based almost exactly on the model constitution. They both were admitted to the Union. I believe both were in the 50s. It was either the late 40s or 50s. And so they were well aware of the model constitution and kind of took that on. These efforts weren't as successful as the progressives had hoped they would be. The progressive movement itself kind of died off in the 30s and was pretty much dead by World War II. Even up through the 50s, though, there was still this push among good government type people who really wanted to see states be more effective. Even Congress put together a commission that was designed to try to encourage states to adopt a more model constitution, to make their constitution shorter. And the thing is that no matter how hard they were pushed and no matter how much states actually tried to rewrite their constitutions, in general, these reform efforts haven't really worked. And in fact, over time, and especially over the last 20 years or so, states' constitutions have gotten longer and more detailed and more particularistic than they were before, which is the opposite of what the poor progressives would have wanted. We saw that when we looked at the Ohio Constitution. We saw how long it is, and some of the amendments that have just recently gone through, like the casino gambling amendment, is very particularistic, incredibly long and detailed. So why is that? Well, it turns out in large part that when you add direct democracy to the mix of how you can change your constitution, there's a really big incentive for states, for interest groups in states, to take advantage of the fact of having an election campaign, essentially, not having to go through the legislature to get what they want, but instead putting it out to the people. And so these interest groups of all kinds, big business, but other kinds of interest groups as well, have really like grabbed onto this idea that, hey, we can get the citizens to vote. And just that has really, really added to the length of many state constitutions, including Ohio's. Just in the past 20 years, Ohio has considered and in many cases passed a bunch of different major, very particularistic additions to the Constitution. So the casino gambling, which we looked at again in class last time, we explored that section of the Constitution. Incredibly detailed, right? Down to the number of floors in the Cleveland casino and how many, whether it could have an underground parking garage or not. We also had a very complicated redistricting reform plan pass. Now that's not necessarily a business interest, that's more of the kind of good government type of interest. But still it was interest groups pushing for that and running campaigns. Marijuana legalization was huge, and that failed as a constitutional amendment, but it was extremely particularistic. It not only said pot would be legalized, but the proposal had all kinds of things built into it that were going to benefit certain growers, and where things could be grown and how to figure out how many growers were allowed. It was very, very incredibly detailed legislation, which I think is one reason it didn't pass. People didn't like that it was so lengthy and complicated. The same-sex marriage ban, that was put in place through the efforts of interest groups who talked Ohioans into passing the same-sex marriage ban. It was a huge controversy. There were many, it was a long advertising campaigns and everything, with people on with groups on both sides advertising. That did pass in 2004, and it was the law in Ohio until 2015. Yes, when the same-sex marriage amendment or court case went through, which we studied last time, when the Supreme Court outlawed those kind of bans. So in general, what I want you to do now is to take take what we've learned about state constitutions and apply it to your own state's constitutions. That's why I had you meeting in your state groups. So this is an activity that you'll all need to work on together on Blackboard. So everybody in your group should pull up activity 1 on Blackboard. It's under the section called in-class activities. And what you'll need to do is download the prompt that has questions on it. I actually have paper copies available if you prefer paper copies of the set of prompts. And you'll notice that you're supposed to each pick a role to play. And I'm going to have you not worry about presenters, because in the last classes we didn't really get to presentations anyway. So don't worry about a presenter. But each group will need a scribe and 2 readers, and then if you're a group of 4, just have that other person help with the scribe to get things together. The scribe will keep the record of what you're doing. You need to create 1 document for the group. Feel free to do that with a Google Doc if you want to. That'll be fine. Talk to each other. When it's the reader's turn, please read the paragraph from the textbook out loud to the rest of your group. That's just to help that everybody has the same information and you're all reading it equally carefully. And at the end, you will have 1 person, the scribe is the person who will submit this on Blackboard, and it's a group submission, so it'll count for all of you. Good luck. I hope that I'm looking forward to reading them, and I will see you again next Tuesday.